Here we are continuing where we left off, creating our application that manages employee information using inheritance. In the previous video, we coded all three of the classes based on the little planning sketch made in the first video. So next, our step is to create constructors for these three classes. And I'm going to start with my employee base class. I want a constructor that is going to set all of the properties of the object when it is created. So we previously learned that a constructor has to be public and it has to be named the same thing as the class. And it brings in information that we use to set the public properties. So I'm going to bring in all three pieces of information, the first name, last name, and phone number, all as strings because those are the properties that we set up. And then I'm going to equal the public property to that value. Next, I'll move on to my full-time class. And I want to create a constructor for the full-time class as well. When creating constructors for derived classes, we have to be prepared to gather all of the information needed for our own constructor and for our base classes constructor. So we will have to gather both properties needed for the full-time employee as well as the four pieces of information needed by our base class constructor. So the syntax for this looks a little different. It's still public and it's still named the same thing as the class. And we're going to pull in all of the information. And so I had my strings over here. So I'm going to need a string for the first name, a string for the last name, and a string for the phone number. And then I'm going to need a decimal for the salary for full-time and an integer for the vacation days. So all of the pieces of information needed for both the base class constructor and the derived class constructor. Now I went ahead and put in the curly brace block, but there's still one more thing we need to do. After the parentheses close, but before the curly brace block, we put colon base. And when you open the parentheses, you'll see that it calls your base class's constructor. The use of the base keyword allows you to access the base class members directly at any time from a derived class. In this case, we need to pass the four pieces of information needed to the employee's constructor. So we're going to pass in the first variable and the last variable and the phone number. These are these three pieces of information that we're accepting from our constructor here, and they're being passed to the base class's constructor. We can then take the two pieces of information that we need to keep and set them to our public properties. Next, we'll do the same thing in the part-time class. Using the same syntax for creating derived class constructors, we'll have to accept the same amount of information, all of the employees' class information, plus one for the hourly rate for our part-time class. And then using that same syntax, colon base, we'll pass the first name string, the last name string, and the phone number to our base class before setting our public property in our derived class. So in the next video, we'll look at how this information is really passed through by setting some breakpoints and looking at why we write our constructors a little differently for our derived classes. And we'll start to look at how we call a derived class and actually create instances of the object. So at this point, you want to go ahead and build and make sure that you have no errors before you pick up with the next video.